In the quiet, tree-lined streets of Maplewood, where neighbors waved from their porches and children played freely on sunlit lawns, it felt like nothing bad could ever happen. Maplewood was the kind of place people moved to when they wanted peace. Stability. A sense of safety. Everyone knew each other's names, and their stories. Or so they thought. Among its most admired residents was Dr. Julia Morgan. A brilliant physician. Compassionate. Composed. The kind of doctor who held your hand when she delivered bad news, and who remembered your daughter's name at every appointment. Patients adored her. Colleagues respected her. Her name was practically synonymous with integrity. But what no one could see, what no one even dared to suspect, was that behind Julia's warm smile was a secret that would devastate everyone who knew her. A lie so deep, so tangled, it would eventually end in blood. Julia was married to Tom Morgan, a high school history teacher known for his patience and kind heart. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't ambitious. But he loved Julia, wholly and without condition. They were high school sweethearts turned college companions. She studied medicine. He studied education. Together, they built a life people envied. And why wouldn't they? Their house was a lovely colonial on Sycamore Drive, filled with books and laughter and dinners shared at the table. They had a golden retriever named Milo. They planted tomatoes in the backyard every spring. On paper, in person, hell, even in photographs, they looked like the perfect couple. But perfection is a mask, and masks crack. As Julia's medical career soared, Tom never once felt left behind. He admired her brilliance. Bragged about her to colleagues. He didn't mind playing a quieter role, he believed in her, and that was enough. But the truth? Julia was changing. At first, it was subtle. She started working later hours. Came home tired. Withdrawn. She brushed it off as stress. Tom believed her. But sometimes, he'd wake in the middle of the night and find her downstairs. Sitting alone in the dark. Lost in thought. Other times, he'd catch her staring at her phone a little too long, her eyes flickering with something he couldn't read. Still, he never accused her. He never questioned. Why would he? Tom believed in Julia. He had no idea that his entire world was slowly crumbling beneath his feet. And Julia? She was slipping further and further from the woman he had married. It wasn't that she stopped loving Tom, at least, that's what she told herself. No, it was something deeper, darker. A gnawing sense of emptiness that her success couldn't fill. A voice inside her whispering, "Is this all there is?" Her work, once fulfilling, now felt mechanical. The patient's stories began to blur. The kindness she gave others left her feeling hollow. She wore the smile. She played the part. But underneath it all, Julia was unraveling. And that's when he walked in. A patient. A charming man with a crooked smile and eyes that saw right through her. But we'll get to him soon. Because in Maplewood, everyone thought they knew Julia Morgan. The doctor. The wife. The pillar of grace and composure. But soon, they'd learn the truth. They'd learn that the woman they trusted with their health had been hiding something far more dangerous than a misdiagnosis. She was hiding betrayal. She was hiding desire. She was hiding a secret life that would shatter everything in its path. And it all started with a single decision. A choice. A moment she could never take back. It began, like most disasters do, with something that didn't feel dangerous at the time. His name was Mark Whitman. Mid-40s. Wealthy. Polished. The kind of man who walked into a room and made people straighten up. He wasn't like Julia's usual patients. He was confident, charming, a little too confident, if you asked anyone else. But Julia didn't mind. Mark came in for routine checkups. High blood pressure, a little stress, nothing serious. He always joked with Julia. Complimented her. Told her she didn't look old enough to be a doctor. She laughed it off. At first. But then came the little touches, fleeting, friendly. His eyes lingered too long. He remembered the color of her blouse. He called her beautiful during appointments. It was harmless, wasn't it? And Julia? She told herself it was nothing. A little attention. A harmless ego boost. After all, she'd been feeling invisible lately, like a machine, not a woman. At home, Tom barely noticed her anymore. He tried, sure, but he didn't see her. Not the way Mark did. Then came the evening that changed everything. It had been a brutal day. One of Julia's patients had received a devastating diagnosis. She was exhausted. Numb. As she was gathering her things, she heard a knock on her office door. It was Mark. "Rough day?" he asked. She nodded. He stepped inside, closed the door, and said gently, "You look like you could use a drink." That's how it started. An invitation. A choice. She hesitated, but not for long. They went to a quiet bar just outside town. Nothing fancy. Just dark lighting, hushed music, and the warm burn of whiskey in her throat. They talked for hours. About life. About work. About the dreams they'd let go of. And when Mark leaned in, his voice soft and dangerous, and said, "I don't think your husband appreciates what he has." Julia didn't pull away. She should have. God, she knew she should have. But instead, she kissed him. It was reckless. It was wrong. And it was the most alive she had felt in years. From that moment, the dam broke. Mark became her escape. Her addiction. Their meetings turned into late-night rendezvous, hotel rooms, parked cars, his downtown apartment. Julia told herself it was just a fling. Something to get her through the hard days. But deep down, she knew. She was spiraling. She still went home to Tom. Still smiled. Still cooked dinner. But every word she spoke to him started to feel like a lie. Every "I love you" was coated in guilt. And yet, she couldn't stop. There was something intoxicating about the secrecy. The danger. She was playing with fire, and loving the burn. But Mark wasn't the only one. Once that line had been crossed, once her moral compass had been shattered, it became easier to blur other boundaries. David came next. A brilliant young lawyer, barely in his 30s, drowning in anxiety from a high-profile case. He came in shaking, overwhelmed. Julia offered him calm, warmth, comfort. Too much comfort. Their sessions went from professional to personal faster than either of them intended. David clung to her. She didn't push him away. Then there was James. A grieving widower, broken by loneliness. He cried in her office, telling her how empty his house felt. How the nights were unbearable. Julia held his hand. Listened. And one night, after a long hug that lasted too long, she didn't stop him when he kissed her. And so it continued. Michael, the troubled artist with a history of trauma. Richard, a former soldier, battling invisible demons from a war he couldn't forget. Each man brought something Julia craved: adoration, vulnerability, escape. And she gave them all what they needed. A hand to hold. A body to touch. A secret they could keep. By the time she realized she was in too deep, it was already too late. She was living in a world of shadows, lying tea. She told herself she was helping them. That it wasn't about lust. That they needed her. But the truth? Julia needed them. Every kiss. Every lie. Every whispered promise in the dark. It made her feel wanted. Alive. Powerful. But she was dancing on the edge of a cliff. And the ground beneath her? It was starting to crack. By now, Julia Morgan was no longer just a doctor. She was a performer. Each day, she stepped into her clinic wearing a mask. Behind it? A woman split in two, half caregiver, half seductress. And the two halves were at war. But the scariest part? She no longer knew which version was real. On the surface, nothing had changed. Her office remained spotless. Her staff never suspected a thing. Patients still praised her for her attentiveness, her empathy. But behind closed doors, behind locked examination rooms and whispered phone calls, Julia was living a life few would dare to imagine. 5 lovers. 5 affairs. Each relationship secret. Each one built on blurred boundaries and hidden truths. And as the web she'd spun tightened, the walls around her began to close in. She wasn't just cheating anymore. She was juggling 5 lives. Mark, the first, the one who made her feel alive. Their passion had cooled, but the connection remained. Mark wanted more. He whispered about her leaving Tom, about building something real. But Julia wasn't ready for real. She was only ready for escape. Then there was David, the hotshot lawyer who had fallen for her hard and fast. His texts came daily, sometimes hourly. I need you. I can't stop thinking about you. It should have been flattering. It was suffocating. James, the widower, was different. Gentle. Sweet. Too sweet. He brought her flowers. Wrote her poetry. Called her his angel. It made her sick with guilt. Because deep down, she knew, she was using him. Michael, the artist, was volatile. Passionate. Moody. He called her at 3 a.m., drunk and crying. Sometimes angry. Sometimes needy. Always intense. With him, everything burned bright, until it nearly burned her alive. And then there was Richard. Oh, Richard. Quiet. Haunted. A man with too many scars and not enough peace. He said she was the first person who made him feel human again. She cried when he said that. Because she didn't know how to tell him that she didn't even feel human herself anymore. Every day, Julia woke up wondering when the house of cards would fall. And every night, she told herself, just one more day. I'll fix this tomorrow. But she never did. Because the truth was, the affairs had stopped being about the men. It wasn't even about Tom anymore. It was about control. In a life that felt increasingly out of her grasp, stressed by patience, exhausted by marriage, crushed by expectation, these affairs gave her a taste of something intoxicating. Power. She could make a man fall in love with a smile. She could keep 5 hearts beating for her while maintaining the illusion of being the perfect wife. It was reckless. It was selfish. But it was hers. And for a while, that was enough. But Tom? He wasn't blind. He may have been patient, kind, trusting, but he wasn't stupid. He noticed the changes. The distance. The way Julia barely looked up from her phone. The way she smiled at things he couldn't see. He tried talking to her. Once. Twice. A dozen times. But Julia always had an answer: it's work. I'm just tired. You're imagining things. And Tom, the man who'd never once doubted her, started to doubt himself instead. He blamed the stress. Maybe he was being insecure. Maybe she was just overworked. But something inside him, it twisted. A cold whisper that refused to be silenced: she's lying. And then one day, Tom saw something that changed everything. He came home early from school. Julia's car was in the driveway. The living room was empty. the kitchen too. But upstairs, he heard laughter. Not hers. A man's. He froze. His heart pounded so hard he thought it might give out. He didn't storm up the stairs. He didn't throw open the door. He just walked back outside. He didn't want confirmation. Not yet. Because once you see the truth, there's no unseeing it. That night, Julia came home late. Hair tousled. Smelling of cologne that wasn't his. She kissed him on the cheek. And Tom? He said nothing. He smiled. And that smile, God help him, was the most painful thing he'd ever worn. Because in that moment, he knew. She was gone. Not physically. Not yet. But the woman he married? She was long, long gone. And still, she kept going. Affair after affair. Lie after lie. Julia told herself she had it under control. But she didn't see what we, the outsiders, can now see so clearly. She was dancing on the edge of a cliff, and every step was taking her closer to the fall. She had built a life made of glass. And the cracks were already forming. They say intuition is a whisper at first. For Tom Morgan, it began with a quiet ache. A knowing he couldn't explain. The way Julia pulled away from his touch. The flicker in her eyes when he asked how her day was. The faint scent of cologne on her blouse that wasn't his. He wanted to believe it was nothing. He needed to believe it was nothing. But doubt is a parasite. It burrows Indiana. Feeds on silence. And Tom, sweet, loyal Tom, had been silent for far too long. He started noticing the small things first. Julia's phone was never far from her hand. She turned the screen away when he walked into the room. Her laughter, once effortless, now felt forced. Hollow. She began working late. Always with some vague excuse. A difficult patient. A late surgery. Emergency calls. But when he asked questions, her answers came too fast. Too rehearsed. And when they sat across from each other at dinner? It was like she wasn't even there. She was texting under the table. Smiling at someone he couldn't see. Lost in a world he no longer belonged to. Still. Tom said nothing. Because he didn't want to be that husband, the jealous one. The paranoid one. The man who let suspicion poison what little they had left. But the silence, it was eating him alive. One afternoon, Tom made a decision. A simple gesture. A kind one. He would surprise Julia at work. Bring her lunch. Her favorite sandwich. Something small to let her know he still cared. He drove to her clinic, heart light with hope. But when he arrived, he was greeted by Julia's receptionist, who looked momentarily uncomfortable. "Oh. Dr. Morgan's out," she said. She left for lunch. With a patient. A patient? Tom's heart sank. He forced a smile. Did she say when she'd be back? Soon, I think. He waited in Julia's office. Sat on the edge of the leather chair, fingers tight around the brown paper bag that now felt ridiculous in his hands. When Julia walked in 20 minutes later, her expression shifted the moment she saw him. Surprise. Then panic. Then, performance. "Tom. What are you doing here?" Her voice was too bright. Too fast. "I thought I'd surprise you," he said gently. "Lunch." She blinked. "Oh, that's sweet. But I already ate." A patient was having a rough day, so we. Tom held up a hand. "It's okay." But it wasn't. Because he saw it. In her eyes. In the way her fingers fumbled with her coat. In the faint smear of lipstick where someone else's lips had been. He smiled anyway. And that smile broke him inside. They sat in awkward silence, nibbling at their sandwiches. Julia made small talk. Weather. Work. Nothing important. Tom stared at her. Really looked at her. The way her eyes darted to her phone. The faint red mark on her neck she'd failed to cover with makeup. The trembling in her voice. She was lying. And worse, she was used to it. That night, Tom didn't sleep. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft, even breaths of the woman lying beside him. The woman he had loved since college. The woman he had built a life with. The woman he no longer recognized. His mind raced with questions. Was it one man? Two? More? Had it started recently, or years ago? Did she still love him? Or was she just waiting for him to find out? The next morning, Julia left early, claiming an emergency consult at the hospital. Tom didn't believe a word. But he didn't say a word either. Because now, the truth wasn't just a suspicion. It was a ghost. And it haunted every moment. He started watching her more closely. Memorizing her routines. Her excuses. Her absences. The late nights. The sudden changes in mood. The way she avoided eye contact when he mentioned trust, or love, or the future. He noticed everything. And still, he said nothing. Because sometimes, the fear of knowing is worse than the lie itself. But that fear? It was about to become something much darker. Because Tom wasn't the only one watching Julia. Someone else had seen the truth. And that truth was about to arrive in an envelope. It came in the mail. No return address. No handwriting. Just a plain white envelope tucked among bills and magazines. Tom didn't think twice when he picked it up. Not until he opened it. Inside was a single sheet of paper. No signature. No explanation. Just one line, typed, cold, merciless. Your wife is cheating on you with multiple patients. That was it. No names. No details. Just the truth. And it hit Tom like a fist to the chest. He sat there, frozen. The paper trembled in his hands, though the house was still. He read it again. And again. Hoping, desperately, that he'd imagined it. That it was a mistake. A cruel prank. But deep down, he knew. The whisper he'd ignored for months had just become a scream. For an hour, he didn't move. He sat at the kitchen table, the letter in front of him like a loaded weapon. He wanted to cry. To scream. To tear the paper into pieces and pretend it never came. But he couldn't. Because the words were already inside him, burned into his soul. She's cheating. Not just once. Not just a mistake. Multiple patients. Multiple men. Multiple lies. When Julia came home that evening, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the kitchen was dim. She walked in like it was any other day. Until she saw him. Sitting still. Staring at her. Her smile faltered. "Tom," she asked, setting down her purse. "Everything okay?" He said nothing. Just slid the letter across the table. Her eyes dropped. Read the sentence. And everything in her body changed. The color drained from her face. Her hands trembled. She swallowed. Hard. And when she looked up, Tom saw something that crushed him more than any affair ever could. Fear. Not confusion. Not outrage. Not denial. Just fear. Who sent this?" she whispered. Her voice cracked. Her fingers crumpled the edge of the paper. Tom didn't blink. "Is it true?" Julia's lips parted. Closed. Opened again. Tom, I don't know who. Is it true? He asked again. Louder now. She tried to speak. But the silence between them had already answered. Her shoulders sagged. She sat down slowly, across from him, tears welling in her eyes. It wasn't supposed to be like this, she whispered. And with those words, the last thread of hope in Tom's heart snapped. How long? He asked. His voice barely audible. Julia looked down. Ashamed. Hollow. A year. Maybe more. Tom flinched. Why? She shook her head. I don't know. That's not good enough, he snapped, his voice breaking. Why, Julia? I gave you everything. Her eyes filled with tears. I know. And I'm sorry. I was lonely. I was tired. You had me. I didn't feel like I had anyone, she whispered. Those words, soft and broken, cut deeper than a blade. Tom pushed back from the table. Stood. Took a shaky breath. I don't even know who you are anymore. Julia rose, reaching for him. Please, Tom. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean. You didn't mean, he laughed bitterly. You cheated on me with patience. You lied. Every day. And you didn't mean to. I was broken, she sobbed. And I didn't know how to fix it. But Tom didn't want apologies. He wanted time to rewind. He wanted the woman he loved back. But she was gone. Replaced by someone he couldn't trust. Someone who'd torn his heart out piece by piece. He grabbed his coat. Where are you going? She cried. Out, he said. And he left her standing there, shaking, crying, and utterly alone. That night, Tom sat in his car for hours. He didn't call anyone. Didn't cry. Didn't even listen to the radio. He just sat in silence, trying to remember who he used to be before the betrayal. Before the lies. Before the truth crashed down and buried his marriage in rubble. And when he finally came home, he didn't speak. Didn't look at her. Just walked upstairs and closed the door. For Julia, the days that followed were suffocating. Tom avoided her completely. He stopped responding to her texts. Stopped meeting her eyes. Stopped caring. And for the first time since the affairs began, Julia felt the full weight of what she'd done. It wasn't just lust. It wasn't just a need to feel wanted. It was destruction. Of love. Of trust. Of a life she had spent decades building. And she had no one to blame but herself. Her lovers began to pull away. Their secret rendezvous turned into awkward silences. David stopped texting. James cancelled his appointments. Richard ghosted her completely. Word was spreading. Her reputation began to rot from the inside out. Whispers in the clinic hallways. Cold glances from coworkers. Cancelled appointments. Rumors. Scandal. Shame. Everything she'd built. It was falling apart. And for the first time, she was terrified she couldn't stop it. When a lie dies, it doesn't go quietly. It unravels. Violently. Piece by piece. And for Dr. Julia Morgan, the unraveling was relentless. In the weeks following Tom's discovery, silence took over the Morgan home. Not the peaceful kind. No, this silence was brutal. Deafening. A constant reminder that something sacred had been broken. Tom moved through the house like a ghost, present, but unreachable. He didn't yell. He didn't demand explanations. He didn't need to. His silence said everything. And Julia? She was crumbling. She tried to fix things at first. She cooked his favorite meals. She left handwritten notes around the house. Little apologies. Desperate pleas. I miss you. I'm sorry. Can we talk? None were answered. Not a word. Not even a glance. Every night, she cried in the bathroom with the water running so he wouldn't hear. Every morning, she put on her makeup and walked into her clinic like nothing was wrong. But something was wrong. Everyone could feel it. Her staff noticed she was distracted. Forgetful. The receptionist, once chatty, barely made eye contact. Nurses whispered behind closed doors. Patients cancelled appointments. The phone stopped ringing. And the worst part? The men she'd betrayed her marriage for, the ones who once worshipped her, were vanishing. Mark stopped calling entirely. David sent one final text, "This is too messy. Please don't contact me again." James, sweet, broken James, filed a formal complaint, claiming emotional misconduct. Michael and Richard disappeared without a word. They had taken what they wanted. And now they were gone. The walls of Julia's life were caving in. Her clinic, once a sanctuary, now felt like a battlefield. Every smile she gave was forced. Every conversation clipped. She was walking on eggshells, terrified of saying the wrong thing, of being seen for what she really was. A fraud. A fallen doctor. A woman spiraling into disgrace. Her medical license came under review. Rumors swirled of unethical behavior. Of boundary violations. Of relationships that should never have happened. And though she tried to deny it, tried to hold her head high, it was clear. Her reputation was finished. And without that? She had nothing left to hide behind. At home, things were no better. Tom no longer slept in their bed. He moved to the guest room. Closed the door each night with quiet finality. Sometimes Julia would knock. Sometimes she would whisper, "Can we talk?" No answer. Just the sound of the lock clicking shut. That click felt like a knife every time. She started drinking. Just a glass of wine, she told herself. To take the edge off. But the edge never dulled. So one glass became two. Then three. Then the bottle. It numbed the guilt. Blurred the memories. Silenced the regret, if only for a few hours. Tom, meanwhile, was being eaten alive by his own storm. He replayed every memory. Every touch. Every laugh. Every lie. He obsessed over details, looking for the moment it all began. Was it that night she worked late? That dinner where she didn't touch her food? That birthday she forgot? He tormented himself with questions that had no answers. And all the while, rage built like a dam behind his ribs. Because the woman he gave his life to had made a mockery of it. Julia tried to reach him one last time. She waited by the kitchen door as he came in from work. "Tom," she said softly, "I know you hate me. I don't blame you. But please, please don't stop loving me." He looked at her. For the first time in days, he really looked at her. Eyes red. Face pale. A ghost of the woman he once adored. "I don't know who you are anymore," he said. Then walked right past her. She collapsed to the floor. Alone. Unwanted. And drowning in the consequence of every choice she had made. The town of Maplewood had turned its back on her. The man who loved her had shut her out. The lovers who desired her had disappeared. And Julia Morgan, once the pride of the community, was now nothing more than a cautionary tale. A woman consumed by her own hunger. A woman who threw away everything, for nothing. And yet, this wasn't the end. No. The final chapter hadn't been written. Because pain has a way of mutating. Of festering. Of turning from heartbreak into something far more dangerous. Something irreversible. Pain doesn't always scream. Sometimes it whispers. Low and constant, until it becomes unbearable. That's what it was like for Tom Morgan. A quiet, gnawing ache that had hollowed him out from the inside. He tried to move on. God, he tried. But how do you move on when the person you loved more than life itself is sleeping just one room away? When her scent still lingers on the pillows? When the memories choke you at every turn? Tom couldn't eat. Couldn't sleep. He wandered the house like a ghost, barely speaking, barely breathing. He stared out windows. He sat in the dark. And every moment, one thought echoed through his mind like a drumbeat. Why? Why did she do it? Why wasn't he enough? Why did the woman he trusted above all else betray him like this? Night after night, he lay awake, while the woman who shattered his heart slept in the next room. And every night, his thoughts grew darker. The love he once felt had curdled into something twisted. Not hatred. Not exactly. Something more venomous. Something worse. Then came the night everything snapped. It started like any other evening. Dinner in silence. Julia tried to speak, twice, but gave up each time. Tom washed the dishes. Julia disappeared upstairs. The air between them was heavy. Unbearable. Tom sat alone at the kitchen table, staring into a cold cup of coffee, shaking. And then he stood up. Something in him broke. Maybe it was the way she looked at him earlier, like he was a stranger. Maybe it was the image of her kissing another man that wouldn't stop replaying in his head. Maybe it was the simple, haunting truth. He couldn't live like this anymore. He climbed the stairs slowly. Each step felt heavier than the last. He didn't know what he was going to say. He didn't even know what he wanted anymore. All he knew was that the pain had finally reached its boiling point. He pushed open the bedroom door. Julia was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window, lost in thought. She turned when she heard him. Her eyes softened. "Tom," she whispered. "Please." But Tom wasn't here to listen. Not anymore. "Why?" he asked, his voice hollow. "Tell me why." Julia looked at him, guilt dripping from her expression. "I don't have an answer," she said. "I wish I did. I was broken, and I made it worse." "I gave you everything," he said, his voice shaking. "My love. My life. My trust." "I know," she whispered. "And you threw it away. For what?" "I don't know," she cried. "I was lonely, and I felt invisible. I needed to feel something again. Then feel this." Tom roared. He grabbed the first thing his hand could find, heavy, cold, solid. A glass paperweight from her desk. Before Julia could move, before she could even scream, he hurled it. It struck the side of her head with a sickening, hollow thud. Julia collapsed. A gasp escaped her lips as she hit the floor, blood already spilling out beneath her. Silence. Not the kind that soothes. The kind that suffocates. Tom stood frozen, the paperweight still in his hand, his chest heaving. Time stopped. Reality shattered. He dropped to his knees beside her, hands trembling as he tried to stop the bleeding. "Julia," he whispered. "No, no, no, stay with me. Please. Please, God." But it was too late. The woman he had loved. The woman he had hated. The woman he had just killed. Lay lifeless on the floor. Tom didn't run. He didn't hide. He sat beside her, covered in her blood, shaking, crying. When the police arrived, tipped off by a 911 call he could barely remember making, they found a man already destroyed. He confessed everything. Didn't even ask for a lawyer. Because what defense is there when you've just killed the only person you've ever truly loved? The trial was a media circus. Maplewood couldn't believe it. Dr. Julia Morgan, beloved physician, dead. Tom Morgan, gentle teacher, charged with second-degree murder. The town that once held them up as a model couple now watched in stunned horror. The prosecution called it a brutal, senseless killing. The defense called it a crime of passion, born of betrayal and psychological torment. But in the end, none of it mattered. Because Julia was still dead. And Tom was sentenced to life in prison. Now he spends his days in a gray cell. No windows. No light. Just silence. The same silence that once filled their home. He sits with the ghosts of his choices. He stares at the wall. And he remembers. He remembers the way she laughed in the mornings. The way she chewed on her lip when she was nervous. The way she betrayed him, and how, in the end, he betrayed himself. Because Tom Morgan wasn't a monster. He was a man broken by love. And when love shatters that violently, sometimes, there's no putting the pieces back together. The courtroom was silent when the verdict was read. Guilty. Second-degree murder. Tom Morgan didn't flinch. He didn't cry. He didn't even blink. He simply nodded, quietly, numbly, like a man who had already accepted his fate long before the jury spoke. His lawyer whispered something in his ear, something about appeals or sentencing procedure, but Tom didn't hear it. All he could hear was the sound of his own life collapsing. Again. The media devoured the story. Headlines screamed across newsstands. Beloved doctor murdered by husband. Small-town scandal, infidelity, affairs, and bloodshed. From perfect couple to killer's cell. Maplewood, once a sleepy, wholesome town, was now infamous. Every street corner whispered their names. Neighbors who once smiled at the Morgans now spoke of them in hushed tones. Some blamed Tom, called him weak, unhinged, a murderer. Others blamed Julia, called her selfish, manipulative, a homewrecker. But most people? They didn't know what to believe. Because in the end, there were no heroes in this story. Only ruins. Tom was sentenced to life in prison. No parole. No chance to rebuild. Just gray walls, cold floors, and memories that clawed at him day and night. He refused visitors. Didn't want sympathy. Didn't want forgiveness. He spent his days in silence, reading, writing, and staring at the small window in his cell, where a thin slice of light would creep in each morning, only to vanish by noon. He kept a photo of Julia by his bed. Not to remember what she'd done. But to remember who she was, before it all fell apart. The girl he met in college. The woman who used to smile at him like he was her whole world. The woman he killed. Julia was buried on a gray morning under a weeping sky. Few people came. Some out of shame. Others out of judgment. Her family sat in stiff silence. No eulogies were read. No words could make sense of a life that had once burned so brightly, only to end in such darkness. Her grave marker read simply. Julia Morgan. 1979 to 2023. Beloved daughter. Lost too soon. But even that felt like a lie. Because Julia hadn't just been lost. She had been consumed, by temptation, by loneliness, by choices she couldn't take back. The clinic she built was shut down. Her medical license formally revoked. The building was sold, stripped bare, repainted. But some say her ghost still lingers there. Not in the walls. But in the whispers. The shame. The memory. As for the men Julia had entangled, they disappeared. Moved away. transferred doctors, changed their names. Not one showed up at her funeral. Not one made a statement. They had loved her in secret, and abandoned her just as quietly. They were the sparks that helped ignite the fire, and then vanished before the ashes had cooled. In Maplewood, people still talk about the Morgans. Not often. Not loudly. But the story never really dies. Parents whisper it to their teens as a warning. Clergy reference it in sermons about temptation and truth. And older couples, walking past that old colonial house on Sycamore Drive, shake their heads and murmur. That's where it happened. But beyond the gossip and scandal, beyond the headlines and horror, this story leaves behind something more profound. A brutal, heartbreaking truth. That even the strongest marriages can break. That even the most compassionate people can deceive. That love, when betrayed, can turn into something. This wasn't a crime of evil. It was a crime of loss. Of trust, shattered. Of pain, weaponized. Of two people, drifting apart until the distance turned deadly. If there's a lesson in the tragedy of Tom and Julia Morgan, it's not just about fidelity. It's about communication. It's about loneliness. It's about how silence, when left too long, can become the loudest scream. In the end, there were no winners. No redemption. Only echoes. Only a town haunted by a love story that became a cautionary tale. Only a man, locked away with the memory of the woman he both adored and destroyed. And only a grave, simple, cold, and still, marking the final chapter of a woman who once had it all, and lost it, piece by piece.